Welcome to another episode of Liquid Assets, where we talk about the business of water. We look at water through the lens of business, policy, and technology. Today, we have Zach Stein, a really old friend, and I think you'll have some really amazing stuff to listen to from Zach.
Hey, Zach Stein here, co-founder of Carbon Collective. We help companies like yours get a better 401k that also happens to be greener. So we help our clients get the fiduciary support of an advisor, unlimited HR support to deal with all of the issues of a 401k. So we get into the problem with you, and financial education for your team, plus access to green portfolios. So if you're looking for help with your 401k, come talk to us.
Zach, can you just give us a quick intro of kind of who you are, what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. Live in the Bay Area, multi-time startup co-founder. We previously met with my last business, which was very similar to Sutro, but specifically focused on the aquaculture space. Well, I imagine we'll talk more about the learnings from that.
Yeah.
And now I run a business called Carbon Collective, where we help individuals, but now primarily businesses, invest in ways that are aligned with their mission. So if you're a sustainably focused business, you can make sure that your 401k has those type of options, while also getting like good things like employee education and stuff like that.
That's super cool. And we were talking about this a little while earlier before we hit the go button. And the really cool thing about Carbon Collective and putting your 401k money is you want to make sure that you're actually making a return, right? And so like part of what you were talking about earlier is you guys have an entire portfolio of companies as a 401k would. And you kind of said, if you were to give a TED talk that like as this portfolio approach, what water companies would be doing well, right? Like how do you guys look at that? Let's just kind of jump into that of like what's your guys' metrics, what water companies are doing well, what water companies are climate focused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that last question is the one that we really focus on. To give background, the science is very clear about what we need to do to solve climate change. It's going to take investment. It's a problem we have to build our way out of. We need to be investing something like 5 to 9 trillion more dollars per year into climate solutions and stop investing in new fossil fuel expansion. We have enough. So we think that should be the definition of sustainable investing. And so that's what we specialize in. It's sustainable investing. We build our strategies that way. But that leaves the question of how do you define what is a company building a climate solution? And water companies was one of those industries that was really interesting to look at from that perspective, because water, like providing water, is, I think, like you could say more or less like a ubiquitous good. There's certainly like bad practices within it, but and there's like many companies that are water companies that focus on sustainability as a core piece of them. But for us to be defined as a climate solutions company, over half of the company's revenue has to be from products or services that actively solve climate change. And so that removes a lot of water companies. If you're monitoring water, that's important, but that's not solving climate change. And so where we really actually were able to drill into is the companies that were focusing in the recycling of
Hmm.
water, and those that were improving efficiency of transportation of water, because those are the areas that is the carbon footprint of water. It's basically moving it. Whenever you need to move water, that's where that carbon footprint comes. So every single drop you can save from being wasted, that's going to make it more energy efficient.
That's such an interesting way to look at it. And that makes so much sense given your guys' actual lens in which you're looking at climate investment anyways, right? So if we were to double click into that around the recycling of water and the efficiency of transportation, if you look at the kind of world of water, right? And in terms of in your lens, what is climate positive versus climate negative water? Are those proper terms to use, by the way? Could I
I think we could just go for it.
Yeah. Like what I get the fact around not having to invest in fossil fuels. And if you can take, wastage drops off of the moving the actual drops of water through transportation or through actually recycling it, are there like interesting technologies there? Or is this just like seriously like if I can make a more efficient pump or if I can figure out a way to not have water being trucked from one spot to the other, like what do these technologies look like? What are these companies doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's more interesting things happening in wastewater, and so like wastewater recycling systems where you're able to take that and reuse that. There's obviously, like, when you go down into the micro scale, it's easy to see companies that specialize in like gray water recycling or on a building level, where you're able to use that same water again. There's also industrial water. So the companies that are making the purification technologies to like take that industrial like wastewater, which I think you could just say like environmentally is just a pretty big negative, climate or otherwise, and be able to recycle and use that, then you're not having to bring in new water, which water almost, you always have to use, you're using gravity, you're using something, you have to move the water up somehow. And that
Yeah.
usually is pumping it. And then when you get to like the straight up pumps, yeah, like the more of that we can electrify, and this is kind of the climate movement broadly, electrify everything. And then when
Mhm.
you could do very interesting things, I mean, this is when you get kind of like the overlap between water and electricity, the different places that we could actually use water as battery, or use only pump the water when the sun is shining, when it's really bright, or when the wind is blowing, we have that excess capacity, then you can actually, that's when the economics can start to also get very favorable, where we could integrate that with those times when electricity is just going to be really cheap.
What
So
Yeah.
just even converting from a system that uses fossil fuels, using diesel pumps or whatever this is, to one that's electrified, that's already a system that is going to be set up to be climate friendly, even if the electricity going into it is still dirty.
Super, super interesting. That's really cool. And when you look at, do you know any of the statistics around the pie chart of like in moving water, right? If we're like looking at what is the actual impact or like implication of focusing on these strategies versus like something else, right? Like is it 90-10? Is it like 50-50, or is it the bulk of water and like energy in the space is contained on this? It'd be kind of interesting to understand like how much does this touch?
Yes. It's so I am looking at Project Drawdown, which is
Uh-huh.
kind of a library of climate solutions right now, because I don't know the answer right off of the top of my head. Yeah, so pressure management and active leak detection are two major ways to reduce leakage. Yeah, water oversupply is that piece. Yeah, I would probably need to. This is not going to be very interesting podcasting of me just looking at this. But as a resource, I would direct people towards Project Drawdown. And they also have things on water heating. So like solar water, and some of those other areas where it's just, where do water and energy meet? That's the areas where we would be looking for climate solutions within it, because we're just not going to get away from water.
Yeah, definitely. Super cool. Yeah, it would be awesome just to even like do a follow up as we write the blog post. We can even follow up with like a smaller episode. I'm gonna start this thing called the drip campaign, which are
Ooh,
like smaller follow ups with folks that I've interviewed on things like Project Drawdown, so we can actually like open that up as a topic in itself. But yeah,
amazing.
for
Amazing.
another date and time.
I always love a good pun.
Yeah, cool. That's super cool. And so if we like zoom out of the waterfront, right, and
Yeah.
we just look at like Carbon Collective as a 401k provider, like walk me through kind of what that looks like. I think it'd just also be interesting to look at the broader scope of what you guys are working at as well.
Yeah. I mean, again, this all kind of goes back to that fact that climate change is a solvable problem. Like, so many of our world's issues don't seem that solvable, but climate change, like, it really is. We have the path, we have the technology we need. It's just a problem of deploying it fast enough. And this is a part of our problem of, probably our listeners are pretty familiar with ESG and
Mhm.
what that acronym means. It's as kind of, this is Wall Street's answer for sustainable investing, and it just does not whatsoever align with the science behind it. And so our theory of change, and this is kind of like similar Tesla model, it's like, well, you just have to build a better car. So it's like, how do we make a better 401k that also happens to be greener? And so we help companies, we not only give them the fiduciary support of being another advisor on the 401k, which is pretty common once a company passes 100 employees here in the US, but we also give their employees access to financial education from real coaches, and we give unlimited support to their HR teams. We do that plus then a series of portfolios from sustainable to ESG to traditional to customizable. So nobody's being forced to invest green. We're just trying to bring options where they haven't been historically.
That's such a smart Trojan model for like implementing a 401k, right? Because like if you think about employees, they don't have that education or know what to invest in, or like the HR, and like, man, that's brilliant. That's brilliant that you like focused giving, it's the freemium model, right? You give away the free HR services and the education around to your employees, and then you get hopefully the big dent you're going to make in that $5 to $9 trillion by moving that capital from corporations and back into more sustainable companies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly. And it's, you know, retirement for us just always made a sense as a place to start because like I'm 33. I think you and I are a similar age.
Yeah,
And so it's like I want to be retiring in like the 2050s. And like that's the decade that people talk about of like, can I swear on this podcast?
you can swear on the podcast. Yeah.
Okay. It's like that's kind of the decade where it's like we either really will know if we've gotten our shit together or not.
Yeah.
And so it's just this deep alignment, especially for people like us who are like, I'm a millennial in my 30s, like really starting to think about my long term future. And it just coincides with this key climate decade of like, if we don't change path significantly, like I'll retire into a world of ever escalating warming.
Yeah. And not to even say that, a lot of millennials are now having kids, right? They're kind of, and you're also putting your kids in a society or a world that we don't really know what the outcome is if we don't fix it today.
Yes. And it's like, that's the point of my retirement savings is so that I can have money to live off of with stability when I stop working.
Yeah.
And so to us, it just makes a lot of sense to kind of have those two goals actually be aligned of environmental stability and my personal stability. And what's fortunate now, it's like very different than what this was 10 years ago, is that it it's not charity.
Yeah.
The economics are behind these technologies. Solar power is the cheapest form of electricity in most places in the world. And pretty soon, solar plus batteries will be the cheapest form of electricity in most places in the world. If you like money and you like electricity, you're going to want to do solar plus batteries, regardless of what you think about the climate.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you're just going to be able to get alpha returns off of these technologies. It's just the most efficient and the most cost effective way of moving forward entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, our bet over the long term is like we are in the middle of a complete overhaul technology change.
Yeah.
And it's like, would you rather be invested in the technologies that are being replaced or those that are replacing them? Same thing. Like, I just don't think we talk about the electric car transformation enough. I know this is a little bit off the topic of water, but it's interesting. 50% of global oil today is used on our roadways. It's used in cars and trucks. So that's half. And most of that is light duty vehicles.
Hmm.
Like that sits in your and my driveway.
That's huge.
That is half of oil's market share is being disrupted by a superior technology.
Yeah.
Electric cars, they are faster, safer. They do everything you like in a car, just better. They're more convenient. So they're quieter and they're going to be cheap. They're much cheaper to maintain and they're going to be cheaper to buy in like the next couple of years up front.
Man, that's huge. What kind of hits me, back to like the relevance of the water conversation. And I don't even know if either of us have an answer for this, but I wonder what's the analogous to water, right? Like there is this phase change shift of vehicles that use fossil fuels that are being kind of leveled up to electric cars with mobility as like the headline. If you take that same argument and bring it over to water, I wonder what like that looks like, right? Like what is the electric car analogy to water? And I
Yeah.
guess, yeah.
I'm curious what you think as being in the space more fully, and then I'll add anything to it if if we're not thinking the same thing.
Yeah, you know what's it's actually kind of funny because if I was last looking at where water is used the most, I think nobody quote me on this, but I think it's like 60 or 70% is generally used for industrial and then like farmland and like agland. And from like the agriculture and farming standpoint, I think if we can figure out how to make farms more efficient, if we can make food more efficient, we can probably affect a big chunk of what's happening with water, right? I think like efficient showers and all this stuff is great. I think it's really, really great work. But I think if we're gonna run the Pareto principle and we're gonna follow 80/20, I think if you can take your biggest chunk from like agriculture, food production, and also meat production, you might end up at a more sustainable water use, like writ large.
Yeah,
That's I think, again, don't quote me on that. So
yeah. I think like I would agree with that largely. I think especially as we see water become a more variable resource, that we're just going to see the economics of efficiency and recycling become clearer and clearer. Like we're seeing this just right now in electrification. Like a friend of mine, they have a company where they're helping like a major REIT, like a real estate investment trust. That's a
Yeah.
big like there are lots of single family homes, and the best IRR that they could get was was electrifying their home fleet and putting better insulation. It was the best return on capital that they could
Huh.
find to do.
Wow.
Was in significantly increasing the energy efficiency and switching everything over to electric and solar for that. And so I could see the similar types of investment because that's just the beauty of efficiency. It's capital upfront, but then it's it's OpEx. It's like in some ways it's like the best parts of capitalism. You do this thing up front and then you're just way more efficient. Your margins just get better
Yeah.
and it could be very predictable. And I think with the new technologies that are coming online and put many that exist, just the economics will just increasingly pencil out. And as we're seeing, part of what we saw with electricity and particularly natural gas with what happened in Putin's invasion and things like that, like that pushed so many more people towards renewable energy because they're like, oh my God, like what is happening to these prices? Like I can't predict my electricity prices anymore. And as a
Yep.
business, that's a lot harder to run versus if you have a 30-year contract for that.
You're
Obviously water rights and stuff like that complicate this. It's the politics of water is different than electricity. But I could see for certain areas, especially ones that might have historically not had that problem, just the economics of efficiency can make a ton of sense.
and I mean, I think an interesting point to make on what you just said is like the politics of water are different than electricity, but electricity once used to be very similar to the politics of water, right? You used to have these centralized coal processing plants or energy processing plants, and you would then from the centralized place send energy out, right? And what did solar do? It like decentralized it. And so I just wonder, back to my first question of like what are the similarities in the energy world and like the telecom world and in other facets that we could potentially build case studies on the water side.
I
Uh,
wonder, like, there's something that's rising in electricity is microgrids,
yeah,
where when you have a macro grid, you can imagine like, a whole city is covered by a single utility or a whole region. And like everyone's sharing energy with each other. And even if you have solar panels, you're still plugged into the grid for at night. But like the microgrid is you do that all like, with a few buildings and you have battery backups and you're all just sharing from that.
yeah.
I wonder if we could end up seeing a similar thing from water and seeing those type of microgrids where you might be doing the type of capturing or recycling on site and then being able to reuse that.
Completely. And this goes back to like the initial point that you just mentioned of water recycling companies and transportation being the best in investments you're seeing right now in Carbon Collective. And if you take those two ideas of limiting transportation and recycling water, you end up with this microgrid, right? Because you don't have to move water from one spot to the other. And you can then take the water you've been using and recycle it or refresh it multiple times over, which kind of gives you that interesting microgrid example as well, based off the investments you guys are making today.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. I think that there are some interesting analogies of what's happening in the energy space and that overlap into water.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I want to take a quick right turn back to
Okay.
kind of how we met. You were the co-founder and CEO of Osmo.
Yeah.
I'd love to like talk a little bit about Osmo's vision. I know you're at Carbon Collective now, but for the audience out there, and then just kind of one walk us through like the promise the vision that you had with Osmo, what problem you were trying to solve, and then also I think it's interesting for a lot of the audience are startup founders and people that are like trying to start ventures in the water space. The second question is just kind of around your startup journey. Like
Yeah.
what did that look like and any sort of learnings?
Yeah. So many learnings. So Osmo Systems was a water monitoring company, and it was founded around some potential insights into more efficient ways of doing optical sensing of water. What I joined my co-founder for it, who eventually it ended up not working out with him, but we continued with someone else who's kind of the initial inventor of this technology when I was 23. So it's like 10 years ago. I was like fresh out of college, like didn't really know much. And I think that informed a lot of what was challenging about what we were doing. The problem that we were working on was pretty cool. In land-based aquaculture, which is like primarily shrimp farming, is like where most of that business is, but there's also other species like tilapia and catfish and things like that. What happens in your water quality is really important. It could impact the health of the fish, it could impact the flavors. And what we're seeing is it's especially shrimp farming is one of the most resource intensive ways, like pound per pound, to raise animal protein. And so we're saying, how could we leverage this technology to help this industry that's not going anywhere be more efficient? And because part of the problem is by not knowing what's going on in real time, the farmers were always in this position of overcorrection. So it's like, oh, we just measured our dissolved oxygen. It was low. Let's turn on the paddle wheels. So you're running a diesel generator for doing that, or you're pulling power from the grid at maybe not the right times and things like that. And, run them longer than necessary or things like that. So it's not kind of like just in time or in demand. Same thing for feed, same thing for chemicals and stuff like that. So that was kind of the promise of what we were building and be able to do, of being able to have affordable, reliable, real-time sensing. A very similar thing to what you're doing at Sutro. And we've talked many a time about how maybe the move to aquaculture can make sense, but just with a different kind of approach technologically. So that's where we started. We ended up raising venture dollars from some awesome investors to go out and do it, and pretty quickly ran into the fact that the technology that we were underlying building this on was like it was a lot further, like closer to the lab bench than we realized. And so we go and do field tests and just like get these results. And so we ended up kind of moving into these different ways of looking at it, initially taking like very basic light sensing and then moving into computer vision and then trying to add kind of a machine learning component on it. But it was ultimately for us, I think what was challenging is we just never got around the fact that the like our risk tolerance, just the stack was really high because we were analyzing chemistry using computer vision and machine learning in a highly bioactive system. It's just like the number of things that could go wrong in that.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you could appreciate, is like, what you built was really hard. And it's like in a system that's full of chlorine.
Yeah.
So imagine something that's deliberately the opposite. So that's kind of what ended doing us in, where we were one of those startups that just, it was ultimately the technology itself was the reason that we didn't make it.
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's like, it's so important to hear those stories too, right? Because I mean, like hard tech hardware is hard, and like it just exponentially requires way more capital to actually deploy sensor systems that then have layered on machine learning, artificial intelligence, and you're then trying to solve this problem, like you said, of like overcorrection, right, in the actual market. And if you screw that up, you could like kill a bunch of, millions of dollars worth of shrimp or something like that. That could be really bad.
It could be really bad. It could be really bad. So very big potential for
Yeah.
it, but it was just, especially as we're coming to this, like it might take us 5 to 7 years just to get to market, and like we did not have that type of time
Yeah. Yeah.
for it. So it was just like it was a misalignment of the the speed at which this type of capital required a return on.
Yeah. Yeah. Entirely. Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Kind of, and we're coming up close on time here, but one of the things I always love to talk about with founders are their origin stories. Like I feel like there's always something in the way that if you look back, hindsight 2020, growing up, your parents, the place you lived, your friends you had, the classes you took in high school, like when you look at your track record of like being at Osmo and starting Carbon Collective now, you were at like Urban Worm before, like that, like why did you do all these things, and why do you do it now? Is there anything that you look back on now that does have a through line? Like, do you see a thread there?
I don't know. I feel like you could appreciate this phrase, which is not original. I've heard it once, but life is only linear in the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
Where it's like I could not have like been 18, been like, oh, that's where I'll be when I'm 33.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Like, no way. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely through lines of like growing up in a house that was like focused on environmental stewardship. I mean, it wasn't the sole focus, but that was certainly a piece of it. Like I remember very distinctly my parents bringing me to see, oh my God, this is my tired dad brain,
Yeah.
the An Inconvenient Truth in
Yes.
theaters when I was 14. And I like remember like walking out of like one of those daytime showings, and I like walked out, I was like super dazed and I was like terrified. Hey, I don't know if everyone's parents was doing that. So
Yeah. My parents definitely didn't. I know that for a fact.
yeah. So it's like I think I had like that basis, but you know, up until 2016, I still thought climate change was a problem for my grandchildren. And it was being in the Bay Area when you were here, when fire season
Yeah.
became a thing, seemingly out of nowhere. It was just like year after year. And having grown up here, like there was never fire season. It was like, oh my, this is here. And that kind of paired with the challenges that we ran into at Osmo was like, all right, this is actually the right time for me to look at what could I do with my professional energies to help address this problem, because it's not my kid's problem or my grandkid's problem. It's my problem.
Wow. I love that. That's cool.
Like,
I actually didn't know that, Zach. That's like
really?
impressive. Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. Last question that I
Yeah.
have is, are you reading any interesting books, or do you have like a book that that like people should read that's, changed you, or a TV show or a Netflix show or a movie?
Oh my God. I'm a big audiobook file. I'm really like right now I go in phases, and I'm either like all podcast, all fiction audiobooks or all nonfiction audiobooks. And I'm
Okay.
right between fiction and nonfiction right now. And I'm reading a very delightful but not very like serious series about it. Have you ever heard the term competence porn?
Competence porn. No,
For
I haven't ever
describing,
heard.
like, you'll recognize it. It's like the type of book where it's like the main character is just so good at what they're doing. It's like really
Mm,
satisfying, like the thief who could like outsmart everyone, and you're just like, oh, it's so good to read.
yeah.
So it's like that, but that's often like a male character.
Okay.
And so this is a female character in the late 1800s in England, and she's like a natural historian and
Huh.
is like super badass and is incredibly witty, and is like this very kind of liberated character in a world that was like built to not have women be liberated whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's called the Veronica Speedwell series, and it's kind of just like it's like detective mystery things, and
Okay.
I've just been like blitzing through those.
That's cool. Is it like, did you ever used to read Nancy Drew?
It's like a much more adult version of that.
Okay, cool. I'll have to definitely check it out.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on the pod, Zach. We'll definitely need to do, a follow-up episode on the Project Drawdown.
Yeah.
But for all of you listening out there, this is Zach Stein from Carbon Collective. You can find Liquid Assets wherever you find your podcasts. And we'll see you guys, hear you guys, watch you, talk to you next time around. Thanks for listening.